Hello and welcome to all of you for today's session of IEI's webinar series with a special focus on the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Kevin Gomez. I'm the program manager here at the Institute for Economic Inquiry at Creighton University. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alex Tabarrok. He's the Bartley J. Madden Chair in Economics at the Mercatus Center and instructor or a professor of economics at George Mason University. He focuses a lot on law and economics, but if you go to his CV, you'll see that he dabbles with a whole variety of different topics. He's authored a number of books, and you've probably recognized him from the widely used textbook, The Modern Principles of Economics. He's also co-founder of a fantastic economics blog, Marginal Revolution. And if you don't follow that blog, you should do that right away. They've been posting, he and Tyler Cowen have been posting daily for 17 years or so. So a lot of good information that's coming out of there. Highly recommend it. And you probably also recognize him from the famous Marginal Revolution University videos that are so helpful in our economics classes. So I'm a huge fan of Dr. Tabarrok, and I know a lot of us here in the session are as well. So we're really looking forward to this talk. So a recorded version of this webinar will be available in IEI's YouTube. Just search Economic Inquiry, and that'll be up in the next few days. And for those of you that just joined, welcome to IEI's webinar series. And with that, I'll go ahead and give the stage to Dr. Alex Tabarrok. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's great to be here. So today I want to talk about incentive design to accelerate a COVID-19 vaccine. This is a joint work with a superstar team of economists, including Nobel Prize winner Michael Kramer, Susan Athey, Christopher Snyder, Jean Lee, and a bunch of really up and coming young economists as well, Juan Camilo Castillo and Brandon Tan. I should also mention Rachel Gunnister, of course. So really a great team. Now let's begin by talking about the situation which we're in right now. So the IMF estimates that COVID is going to cause about a $12 trillion loss to the world economy over the next year or two. That's 500 billion a month, just a staggering loss. Putting it the other way, however, what this means is that advancing an effective vaccine by as little as, say, 3 to 6 months, that could generate gains in the trillions of dollars. Now, how do we know this? Well, one way that we know this actually is just by looking at the stock market. So every time there's just even a little bit of good news about vaccines, 50 patients, showed neutralizing antibodies in a phase 1 trial, and boom, the stock market jumps up, the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, and so forth. So there's a tremendous interest in vaccines. And the upshot of this paper is that, in fact, we can plausibly advance a vaccine by 3 to 6 months by spending on the order of $100 billion. And really, this is what I call the world's easiest cost-benefit calculation, because billions are much, much less than trillions. Okay, so this is not a hard cost benefit. This is the world's easiest cost benefit calculation. Billions are less than trillions. Now, you might say, well, I agree with you. Clearly, vaccines are important, but people want them. People are clearly going to be willing to buy a vaccine. So what's the market failure? Why do we need some government plan when vaccines are clearly valuable and people want to buy them? And here I think we're just in an extremely unusual situation where the social value of a treatment just far exceeds the private value to the manufacturer. And again, you can see this by looking at the reactions in the stock market. So this is a quote recently, General Electric stock was racing higher Tuesday, but not because of anything the company did or announced. Recent COVID vaccine news is serving as a catalyst, and every stock these days feels like a vaccine stock. So to cite one of Michael Kramer's famous papers, the vaccine sector has become the O-ring sector for the entire economy. A sector which in itself may not be that big or may not seem that important, a simple O-ring, and yet the entire economy depends upon getting this O-ring right. If we can get the vaccines right, then the economy will recover. And it's hard for a vaccine manufacturer to capture all or even a large share of the value of getting the entire economy working again. On the day of this good piece of news that the General Electric reacted to, Moderna, the vaccine company in question, they increased in value by $5 billion on this good news. It's not bad. That's not bad. But General Electric, they increased in value by $6.8 billion. So clearly Moderna was not capturing all of the value that it was generating for General Electric. And if the airlines went up as well, and so a whole bunch of stocks went up. So the vaccine companies are not able to collect all of the value that they're going to be generating. And that means that they don't have strong enough incentives to do as much investment as we would ideally like. Now, this is a general problem. Nordhaus, for example, estimates that innovators in general get only a small share of the fraction of the value, small share of the value which they generate, maybe 2.2%. And when we've got lots of time, we have various institutions that kind of try and make up for this. We have patents, we have R&D tax credits, we have investments in universities, and so forth, okay? But here, what we are dealing with is something of extreme time constraints, right? So we're gonna wanna make some changes very, very rapidly in order to get over this COVID disease. Moreover, the ways in which firms do capture a share of the value in which they generate could be extremely inefficient. So we know that patents, let's say with a monopoly, the patent price is above the competitive price, okay? And we know that generates some allocative inefficiency. But here, actually, the situation is even more extreme because there's lots of externalities from a vaccine. If I get vaccinated, that benefits you because it helps to create herd immunity. So in fact, with a vaccine, the competitive price itself is too high. So the difference between the monopoly price and the competitive price is even larger than it is normally. So there's a big, big allocative inefficiency. So you really don't want monopoly pricing in a situation like this. Now, let's take a closer look at this problem, where exactly the market failure is. And there's a couple of reasons for it. So one reason is most vaccines fail. It's hard. It's hard to make a vaccine. And as a result, a firm typically doesn't want to invest in capacity in building a vaccine factory until their vaccine is approved. So they're going to wait to see whether the vaccine is successful, whether it's approved or not, and then they're going to start to build the factory. But that, building the factory itself, can take months, even years on a normal time schedule to build. Now, if we were to adopt that in this situation, that means we could have an approved vaccine and then still have to wait, frustratingly, as thousands of people die every single day, still having to wait with a vaccine in hand. You got to wait to build the factory before you can mass scale. That would be terrible. So we don't want that to happen. Firms naturally also kind of want a smooth capacity utilization over time. And there's two reasons for this. One is because that can help them price discriminate. So firms would like to set a high price at the beginning and then set a lower price over time, for the same reasons that firms sell a hardback book, right, for a high price at the beginning, and then they sell the softback at a lower price over time, comes out 6 months or a year later. So firms would want a smooth capacity. It's also cheaper to produce 300 million doses, let's say, over a year than it is over a month, okay? But what we want, what is socially optimal, is to vaccinate lots of people quickly. We want to start producing lots of doses before a vaccine is even approved. So we want to incentivize firms not to wait to build those factories until after the vaccine is approved, but to start building the factories now. And we want them not to build a factory where they can spread out production over time. We want them to build a giant factory which can produce lots and lots of vaccines very quickly. And then if the factory becomes worthless, 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, that's okay. That's not good for firm profits, but that is good. That is socially optimal. So that's the sort of thing we want to incentivize. Now, you might have heard about Operation Warp Speed, which is the Trump's administration's plan for vaccine. And indeed, I think Operation Warp Speed is the right idea. It's what we recommended early on. And you can see that it's the right idea with just some simple back of the envelope calculations. So we know, for example, that the United States has paid AstraZeneca, which is a pharmaceutical company, $1.2 billion for 300 million doses for a vaccine that may never be approved. I mean, it's looking good, but it's not 100%. So that vaccine might not be approved. We don't know that for sure yet. It's going through phase 3 trials. Now, is it worth it? Is it worth it paying now for a vaccine that might not be approved? And the answer is yes, absolutely. It is really worth it. A $1.2 billion investment is worth making if we knew that it would accelerate a vaccine by just 10 hours. That sounds extreme, but the mathematics is pretty simple. The United States is losing about $90 billion a month. That's approximately $3 billion a day. So that means that if a vaccine will get the economy going half a day or a third of a day sooner, then it's worthwhile. So that's where that calculation comes from. So Operation Warp Speed is doing the right thing. The question is it fast enough? Is it big enough? And I want to emphasize here that it's not just the developing countries which should be investing now in producing capacity for vaccine doses. This is happening all over the world. And even in poorer countries, you get a very similar kind of cost-benefit calculation. So Peru, for example, is having a huge economic disaster. They have something like 50% unemployment in the urban centers, a massive drop in GDP. Peru has a GDP, let's do a back of the envelope calculation again. Peru has a GDP of about 222 billion, population of just over 30 million. Let's say that they're going to lose 5% GDP because of COVID. That's a very conservative estimate, given how much they're dropping already. That would be worth 5%. That would be worth 5.6 billion. Investing in the AstraZeneca vaccine for 30 million doses, that's basically their entire population, at 120 million, $4 per dose. That's the same price the United States got. That would be worthwhile if the AstraZeneca vaccine accelerated recovery in Peru by about 8 days. So again, that seems like a no-brainer that one should make an investment like that. And in fact, you don't even need, if we're going to be precise, you don't even need to vaccinate the whole population. You could vaccinate half the population and probably hit herd immunity. So 60 billion. But already you were in the right ballpark. Already this was an amazing deal. So this tells you that investing in these vaccines is something which countries should do now. Now, these back of the envelope calculations then raise some kind of deeper questions. If one vaccine is good, why not two? Okay. How many shots on goal would be optimal? And how much capacity do we want? 100 million doses a month, 300 million? How big should the factories be? So solving these problems requires some practical knowledge about vaccines, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then we're going to have some questions. Should we solve for what the individual countries should do and add up to find what the global market might look like and make some predictions? Or should we solve for the global optimum, assume that we have a unified kind of world government, something like that, and say, well, what would be best for the world to do? So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the global optimum. Okay, and then that raises the question, okay, if we know what the global optimum should be, how could we make the global optimum consistent with firm incentives? And then finally, how can we make the global optimum consistent with country incentives? So you got to pay the firms in order to produce the global optimum, and you got to raise the money to pay the firms from the countries. So we're going to have to think about these multiple incentive problems. Okay, so that's basically the structure of where we're going. A little bit of background now on vaccines. So there's actually lots of different types. You're probably most familiar with the kind of traditional vaccine, which is a killed, inactivated, or weakened vaccine. And this is where you take the virus and you weaken it or you kill it, and then you basically inject the virus, the killed virus, into the body. That gives the body's immune system kind of a, excuse me, kind of a early warning, kind of gets them a sneak peek at what the live virus looks like. And so the body's immune system ramps up. It learns how to attack the virus efficiently so that when the live virus hits, the body's immune system has been trained how to fight it. More recently, there's a whole bunch of new technologies for producing and creating viruses. So these viral vectors are kind of interesting. Here you take the DNA from a chunk of the deadly virus, and you insert it into a less deadly virus, a virus which doesn't harm us very much, like a cold virus. And then you give that to people, you inject people with that virus, and then that virus then gets into the body and it generates the antigens. It generates these pieces from the DNA of the deadly virus, just parts of it. So you don't give the whole thing. You just give parts of it, like the spike protein or something like that. And again, the body's immune system can then recognize parts of the live virus and get pre-trained. Then there are these nucleic acid vaccines, DNA and mRNA vaccines. And here, you actually just inject the body with the blueprint for, again, part of the virus. And then the body picks up the blueprint, it starts producing the antigens, and then the body's immune system kicks into place and so forth. And there's others, there's protein subunit and virus-like particles as well. Now, for our purposes, what we care about is that each one of these platforms or each one of these types of vaccines, there's some fungibility in production, but not that much. Like, for example, in fill and finish, where you are the end stage, many of these vaccines will require a similar fill and finish stage where you're injecting the vaccine into vials or into bags. Many of them will also require needles and adjuvants. We can talk about that. So they require similar things at the end stage, but producing them can be quite different. So you need, and this is the point, you need a different kind of factory for each type of vaccine, okay? You need a different type of factory for the different types of vaccines. And these factories are complicated. They are complex manufacturing devices. In fact, they're more complex than manufacturing. In the vaccine industry, they have a phrase, they say that the process is the product. And what they mean by that is you can have a formula for the vaccine, and it doesn't help you that much because the process is really where the comparative advantage is at. It's where the hurdles are. It's the difficult thing. It's like if you give me the recipe for a souffle, okay, I'm going to blow it, right? The souffle is going to collapse, right? So you really need an expert chef in order to take a formula, take a recipe, and to produce something which is beautiful. And the same thing is true with vaccines. It's a complicated process involving very precise conditions, heat and temperature, and sterile conditions, and timing has to be exactly right, okay? And so this takes some time. It takes time to build these factories. You can't just build them out of the box. Okay, so with that in mind, then let's think about what kind of a global plan would look like. And we want to clearly compare the social benefits of a vaccine with the social costs, and then create an optimization. The social benefit is avoiding this 500 billion monthly loss, and also saving lives, of course. Okay. Now notice that the expected social benefit, this increases the greater the probability of a successful vaccine. Okay. So more vaccines is going to make it more likely that we're able to vaccinate, we're able to get a success. Remember, most vaccines fail, okay? So we're going to want multiple shots on goal. The second kind of a source of social benefit is to actually vaccinate people. So we want a successful vaccine, and then the earlier and the more people are vaccinated, then the closer, the quicker we get back to normality, the quicker these costs go away. That's the social benefit. The social cost comes from the cost of building these factories, the cost of capacity installation. And this doesn't literally have to be building the factories from scratch, okay? We may be repurposing, so we may be taking some bioreactor capacity from flu vaccines and turning it into pandemic vaccines. We may be taking a factory and speeding it up, which is already partly built, and speeding it up. There's all kinds of ways in which we can repurpose existing capacity in order to get us a little bit faster towards a vaccine. And note that we want capacity to be available for each type of vaccine candidate, okay? We can't just build one factory. If we're gonna have multiple candidates, 5 or 6 or more vaccine candidates, we're gonna need multiple factories, okay? And some of them may never be used. Some of these factories may never be used if that vaccine is not approved, if it fails in phase 2 or phase 3 trials. But it is much cheaper to build a factory for a vaccine that fails than it is to have an approved vaccine that works and have no way of delivering it. That's much cheaper. Now, the trade-off here is going to be that the more candidates, then the more factories we need, the more capacity repurposing. And that's going to be what we're going to have to balance off to find an optimum. To be a little bit more precise, there's really kind of 2 key diminishing returns, which we're going to balance. The vaccine candidates are not identical. So adding a second candidate increases the probability that at least one of them will work. So you might want a live attenuated vaccine, a killed vaccine, an mRNA vaccine, a DNA vaccine. So they're different types, okay, because they're diverse. That's going to add to your probability of having at least one of them be successful, okay? And of course, you're going to start with the strongest candidate, and then you're going to get progressively, less and less candidates which have a smaller probability of working. But given the situation which we're in right now, even a small probability of success is going to be worth a lot, okay? So what we calculate is actually you're going to need quite a few candidates, okay, like 15 to 20, okay, to reach a 75 to 80% chance of success. And here, success means not simply being approved, it means getting shots in arms. It means the entire supply chain has to be able to deliver. So that's one diminishing return, okay? More candidates, greater probability of success, but at a diminishing rate. the second diminishing return is in capacity. The more capacity you have per candidate, okay, the faster the population can be vaccinated. But there's two reasons for it to diminish with more capacity. First, any sensible plan is going to vaccinate the high-risk people first. So the more and more people you vaccinate, your benefits diminish. The second is that doubling capacity doubles costs, and that halves the time to vaccinate. But this means that each doubling is getting more and more expensive, and each halving of the time to vaccinate is getting you less and less time in an absolute sense. So for example, how long does it take to vaccinate 1.2 billion people? If you have the capacity to produce 100 million doses per month, it takes you 12 months to vaccinate 1.2 billion people. If you double that capacity, you can half the time to 6 months. So you have a gain of 6 months. If you double capacity again, which is now 4 times the cost that you had at the beginning, well, now you half the time again, but now that's only taking you from 6 months to 3 months, okay? So your gain in time is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and your costs of increasing the capacity are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So we have a diminishing return here, okay? So the idea is to balance these two kinds of diminishing returns, the candidates and the capacity. Now, to do this, you need some real numbers, okay? So this is not the kind of usual situation where you draw some curves, on the blackboard and you say, aha, here's the optimum, all right? It's where the curves meet. In this situation, we need actual numbers. So, because we're going to be advising, hopefully, governments and citizens about what is the actual number, not X meets the spot. We want an actual number. So one of the first things we did is we gathered data on there's over 100 different vaccine candidates in production or being proposed, being researched, and we assigned probabilities to them. Based upon the platform, the type of vaccine, like the killed virus vaccines, we've got lots of experience producing them. So you have a pretty decent chance of working. We understand how to do that. The mRNA vaccines, it's a great new technology, has never been done at scale, all the way to shots in arms. Okay, it's been done, I think, in some, not for humans. It's been done for some veterinary vaccines, but hasn't been done for humans. So probabilities are going to be lower. A candidate in phase 2 trials is more likely to succeed than one in phase 1 trials, and a candidate in phase 3 trials is more likely to succeed than one in phase 2 trials. So we take into account that stage that they're at and so forth. And we look at the historical record, and taking into account that we want a very fast time scale, faster than ever before, we try and assign some numbers, some probabilities. We talked with a bunch of experts to help us to do this, but the experts, although very helpful, they don't know either, right? This is not a number that you can look up. This is a number which has to be estimated, which based upon non-historical information, right? History is some guide, but we've never had a situation like the one we're in now. So we make some best estimates. The other thing that we need to do to get an actual number here is we need some estimates on the cost of capacity, okay? We're gonna want to vaccinate billions of people within a very short time frame. Can that even be done? Well, the WHO estimated around 2015, 2016, that there was pandemic capacity for 6.4 billion doses in a year, mostly from repurposing flu vaccine capacity. The WHO did not take into account the new types of vaccines, the mRNA and DNA vaccines, so that should add something because they use a different type of factory. They also did not take into account the possibility of repurposing non-GMP bioreactor capacity, and that is bioreactor capacity which is not been quite up to the precise conditions required for humans in a developing country, but maybe is used for other purposes. It might be used for veterinary purposes. It might be used, other countries might have a slightly lower safety, not really safety, but slightly lower testing regime. We might be able to bring that up, okay? Also this bioreactor capacity, they're used for drugs, even for foods. So there might be a possibility of repurposing some of that capacity. So that looks pretty good, 6.4 billion doses. However, we don't need just doses. We need vials, needles, adjuvants, the whole delivery process. Like some of these vaccines, they have to be kept extremely cold all the way from the lab onto the trucks, onto the planes, to the doctor's offices, all the way to where they're going to be delivered. So that's going to be quite difficult in many developing countries, for example. So you need a whole supply chain for cold storage, right? So taking into this account, the WHO numbers may be too optimistic. A lot here also depends upon chance. When we test these vaccines in phase 2 and phase 3 trials, we're going to see how much do we need for the vaccine to be effective. If a vaccine requires 50 micrograms, then you need half as much capacity if it requires 100 micrograms. And that, we don't know. That could just happen, right? So we might get lucky and find a vaccine which requires only 50 micrograms, and therefore that's like doubling your capacity. Or we might find that the vaccine requires 2 doses, or 3 doses. And then that's like halving your capacity or a third of your capacity. So a lot depends upon how effective these vaccines are, whether we have enough capacity or how much capacity we have for billions of doses. What we assume in the paper is that we can manufacture 200 million doses per month, available at a pretty low constant cost. And then after that, we have an elasticity of supply of 1/3. So kind of pretty low elasticity of supply. Now, let's think about the benefits of vaccination. Well, you can think about H as getting back to normal, okay? H is what we need to get back to normal. As we vaccinate people, okay, we get closer and closer to H, but we're going to start vaccinating the high-risk people first, okay? And then you vaccinate the less and less risk people. So you have a diminishing returns. Excuse me. We have to discount this by the probability that we're going to be successful. So if you only have an 80% chance of probability, which is pretty high, even when you vaccinate everybody, that's still just an 80% chance of getting back to normal. So there's 2 considerations here. What's the probability? And how quickly can we vaccinate? So let's look at that in more detail. If we have more candidates, then the probability that one of them, at least one of them, is going to be successful, that goes up. So that lifts this social benefit curve. Okay, there's a higher probability of being successful. The other way we can increase social benefits is by having more capacity, which pushes the curve to the left, okay? Pushes the curve to the left, and that increases social benefits. So if you can vaccinate more people more quickly, then that's also good, right? And the trade-off, right, is that if we have more candidates, then we've got to build more factories, which is expensive. So you might not want to do that. If you have fewer candidates, you can build a bigger factory. You can afford to build a bigger factory. So that's going to be the trade-off. Okay, what do we find? Okay, so when we run this in the computer, we optimize, okay, use some algorithms, we optimize. We find that our kind of a baseline optimum is the world wants like 18 candidates with a capacity of about 500 million doses per month, okay? Now, clearly there's lots of uncertainty here, lots of uncertainty. So we're going to want to look at a range of parameters and compute the optimal policy for each scenario and see what we get. And fortunately, we find the following. we find that when you change the parameters, that does change the optimal program, the number of candidates and the amount of capacity that you want. But if you mistakenly just follow the baseline, you still get a huge share of the benefits. And basically what this is telling us is that this is such a big problem that all we need to do is get in the right ballpark. If we get in the right ballpark, we're going to get a large share of the benefits. Again, this is like billions or less than trillions, okay? So we might be off. We might choose the slightly wrong number of candidates, for example, might not be quite at the optimum, but we're still gonna get a huge share of the benefits, okay? And this is kind of shown in this table. I know it's a little bit hard to read with my face in the way, but we vary a whole bunch of different things. So for example, if there's a low probability, if we reduce the probability that candidates are successful, that any vaccine is successful, that increases the optimal number of candidates. It makes your program very expensive, but if you were just mistakenly to do the baseline, you would still get 98.5% of the benefits. Okay. We also assume, suppose that we discount the benefits, like there's a probability or possibility that a treatment will arrive and that'll make a vaccine less valuable, okay? So we assume that there's actually a 50% probability that a treatment will arrive which reduces the value of the vaccine by 50%. Suppose we increase that to 75. Well, then you want to invest in fewer candidates, only 11. It's cheaper, okay? But if you just did the baseline anyway, mistakenly, if you didn't optimize correctly, you just did the baseline, you get 95% of the benefits, okay? So that's telling us that hit the right ballpark and you'll do okay. Okay, now, how do we get the firms to do this? So we want to talk about designing incentives. There's two kinds of, broadly speaking, incentives. There's pull funding and push funding. So pull funding is paying for outcomes. In this case, you say something like, we will pay $100 per dose for any vaccine, which is such and such amount of effectiveness, 80% of effective and, available with this safety profile, okay? And that type of pull funding is very good for incentivizing performance, okay? You dangle the carrot, which is the price that the firm will receive if the firm is successful, and you let the firm figure out how can we get there as quickly as possible in the best way possible. So pull funding has a lot of advantages, but as we're going to see, there are also some problems which might make us want to use push funding as well. Push funding is just paying for costs. So you say to the firm, okay, what's it going to cost to install a factory capable of producing 100 million doses a month? We'll pay for that. Okay, you just pay their costs. Now, clearly, if you were just to do literally what I said, everyone would raise their hand, oh, I have a factory, please, pay for my factory to be built. Okay, so you don't quite want to do that. But that's the basic idea of push funding, you pay their costs. What we suggest actually is that a lot of push funding, and you should pay something like 85% of the costs. So that leaves 15% as a at risk, a skin in the game. Okay, so the firms have to pay 15% of their own costs. That gives them some skin in the game. So not every firm is going to want to take that deal. The firms which are unlikely to succeed, they'll say no, which is good. That's what we want. Okay, but it's a lot of push funding. And then you calculate the amount of pull funding, such given that you're paying 85% of their costs, how much pull funding do we need to pull in the number of candidates which we think is optimal? In this case, 18 candidates, okay? And that means you have to pull in the marginal candidates. We also think that you can optimize with the pull funding a little bit by, you can create even better incentives for dynamic efficiency. So we know that we want ultimately price to equal marginal cost, okay? but you can set up the pull funding such that you have a price, let's say, of $35 per dose for the first billion doses, and then $5 per dose for the second, billion doses, something like that. So the idea is that you can have a pull funding which declines in price over time. That gives firms some incentive for speed. And that also means that on the margin, okay, your price is equal to marginal cost, so you get to allocative efficiency. Okay, so that's the combination of pull and push funding. Now you might be asking, and you might be thinking, why so much push, right? I just said pull funding has all of these nice properties that you just dangle the carrot and you let the firm choose how to get there. And that's ordinarily kind of what you want. And in fact, that's how the successful advanced market commitment for the pneumococcus vaccine. So this was a program which Michael Kramer in part won the Nobel Prize for. Chris Snyder, also on our team, also worked on the pneumococcus advanced market commitment. This is where Bill Gates first became interested in vaccines. He funded a bunch of this. And there, it was basically pull funding. So the Gates Foundation and a bunch of governments said, here's the type of vaccine we want. Here's what we're willing to pay, okay? We guarantee you a market. We guarantee we will buy hundreds of billions of doses if you produce a vaccine which does this. And it was very, very successful. Millions of people were vaccinated. It saved at least 700,000 lives. It was definitely worthwhile a Nobel Prize, okay? Now, so why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing that? Well, in this situation, we want to encourage multiple firms. Okay? We want lots of candidates. And it turns out that pull funding is very expensive in this situation. So suppose we have 3 candidates. And candidate A has a 20% chance of success. Candidate B, 10%, and candidate C has a 5% chance of success. Now for push funding, you just pay them to build a factory. So it might be $400 million to produce a factory capable of producing 100 million doses in a month. So that's like $4 per dose. That's where the $4 comes from. And here, notice that the $4 is the same regardless of which factory you're building. Okay, so it doesn't vary depending upon the probability of success. But now think about pull funding. Okay. In order to cover that $4, a vaccine which has a 20% chance of success, you have to dangle a carrot of $20. Because $20, if you're successful, times the probability of success of 20% is $4. So we'll assume the firms are risk neutral, make our lives simple. So a firm would be indifferent between being paid $4 to produce the capacity, produce the factory, or being paid $20 per dose, okay, with a 20% chance of success. But now for candidate B, which has a 10% chance of success, you've got to pay them $40 per dose, okay? Because 40 times 10% is $4. For candidate C with a 5% chance of success, you've got to pay them $80. And now, suppose you don't know which candidate is which, okay? Suppose the government has no way of figuring out which is the really high probability, which is the low probability, or there's can't make transactions costs are too high to make separate agreements. If that's the case, you have to pay all 3 firms $80 per dose if you want to get all 3 candidates producing. And remember, we want like 18 candidates. So that 18th candidate has a very low probability of success. That means you have to have a lot of pull funding. That means you're giving a much higher price to the firms which have a high probability of success than they actually need. You're giving them a lot of rent, okay? And it's expensive. And if you work out the numbers here, even in this simple example, you find out that push funding is like half the price of pull funding. Okay, and that the principle generalizes, not the specific number, but the principle generalizes that in a situation like this, push funding can be much cheaper than pull funding. And that's why we think you still want some pull funding to get the benefits of speed and to get you to dynamic efficiency. but you want a lot of push funding in this situation. Okay, that's how you incentivize the firms. How then do you incentivize the countries to pay for this, right? And I'm just going to mention one kind of point here, and this is where the dismal science comes in, okay? Because when you look at a global plan, the biggest benefit is that if you had a global plan, you could allocate these vaccine doses to the highest risk people in the world, right? First. And you could, in principle, allocate doses in a way to save the most lives. And that seems like something desirable. That's certainly what motivates Bill Gates and CEPI, which is an organization producing vaccines. That's their motivation. Okay. However, here's the dismal science. If you want countries to join a global plan, you have to make them better off than they would be if they went it alone. And that puts a constraint on how much redistribution is possible. So you can't tell the rich countries, you guys pay, but then you're last in line. If the rich countries are paying more, then they're going to want to be at the top. And that's just a fact of life. I mean, it's a sad fact maybe, but that's a constraint. It's a participation constraint in the language of economics. And you really need to respect that participation constraint or people won't join your program. And in fact, even when you do respect that participation constraint, you want people to join. Like it's good for the poorer countries that the high income countries, they want them to join. So a global plan which respects participation constraints, that's going to be better off for everyone, even if it isn't perfectly fair according to some ethical standard. So this is kind of the throwing cold water that we have been telling people, which sometimes they don't like to hear. Okay, but that's the dismal science for you. Now, there are some benefits of global cooperation, even respecting participation constraints. Countries which go it alone, they can do a lot, like Operation Warp Speed, but there's still some advantages. So by going in on a global plan, you might get access to a larger portfolio, okay? Maybe transactions costs are such that it's difficult to make dozens of bilateral agreements, and you're more likely to be successful if you go in the global plan and they can have 18 agreements, right? So you might get more shots on goal, and that's important because this is a situation where just being successful, getting that one success is everything, right? So as Larry Summers says, look, if you're going to starve, if you don't get a pizza in the next 2 hours, you order like 5 pizzas, okay? Even if you're not going to eat them all, right? So it can be beneficial to have access to a bigger portfolio, and that might be possible in a global plan. A global plan can also help to avoid the dangers of vaccine nationalism, okay? So the supply chains for vaccines, as for many other products in the world today, are global. So one country produces the vials, another country produces the stoppers for the vials, okay? Another country produces the adjuvant, things like shark liver oil, okay? It's kind of all kinds of funny things which go into these vaccines. And if we have a situation of vaccine nationalism, a country may say, well, we're not going to give you any of our shark liver oil, okay, let's say, right? And if lots of countries act in this way, you can get all of them being worse off, right? You can have supply chains break down, right? We saw this with respect to masks and things like that. So the US government said, we're not going to send any masks to Canada. And then later they realized that Canada actually produces a lot of masks for the United States. So Canada said, well, if you're not going to send us this, we're not going to send you that. And that was a dumb idea, okay? So we might avoid some vaccine nationalism by at least having some global plan. It can also improve the bargaining power with the firms. That's another possible benefit. Okay, so there are some benefits to a global plan, and maybe some light cooperation is called for. A key point, absolutely key point, which I want to emphasize, is that the economic damages from COVID are so severe that it is in each major country's interest to vaccinate a substantial share of their population quickly. But fast means big. So if the United States produces enough capacity to manufacture 300 million doses in a month, that means they can do their entire population in a month. And then that factory is available for 11 months, the rest of the year, to produce 3.3 million doses, if I got the numbers right, billion doses, right? So going fast means going big, but then you vaccinate your population and you have that factory's capacity available for the rest of the world. So a lot of people are worried that the developing countries like the United States, that they're going to monopolize the capacity. And that is a worry, but not if we're building capacity. And that's kind of what we want countries to do, both for their own good and for the good of the world. So this is a case where an optimal plan is actually one where we're all in the same boat, because going fast, even if you just care about yourself, even if you just care about your own country, you want to go fast. But that means that you're going to go big, and that means that there's lots of capacity for the rest of the world once you've vaccinated your own population. So capacity abundance is the antidote to disputes over distribution. Capacity abundance is the antidote to disputes over distribution. Okay, so let me conclude, then I'll have take some questions. Given the enormous benefits of accelerating a vaccine, it is worth investing in vaccine capacity in parallel with testing. So you want to invest now, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, okay? You want to invest early and big. That is going to pay. You want to invest in a diversified pool of candidates. And this is in the interests, not just of the rich countries, but of low and middle income countries as well. So the low and middle income countries, you might think that maybe a poor country should say, well, I'll wait until, the rest of the world has decided what to do, and I'll pick up some at the end. Maybe that's the best that I can do, right? No, even the poor countries should be investing as much as they can, okay, now, especially if that increases capacity. To incentivize firms, the optimal incentive includes a large push component, okay, with big upfront payments for capacity installation in exchange for an option to purchase vaccine. Pooled funding should be used to incentivize speed and to get you to allocative efficiency. And then finally, capacity abundance is the antidote to disputes over distribution. So that is the big message. Thanks very much.